These conspiracy theories turned out to be 100% true. So, we have seen a lot of conspiracy theories come true in the music industry lately, especially since the death of Clive Davis. People are finally ready to speak on what is really happening in Hollywood. And something that has been a conspiracy theory for a very long time but has been confirmed is the fact that the music industry does not always discover hits naturally. Sometimes there is something called payola, which is when music executives pay for radio play and broadcast exposure and are secretly influenced by either money, gifts, services, or other valuable things to make it like kind of legal, you know? This was really more prominent before streaming, although it is also happening within Spotify, like people being paid to be on the front page or in people's like new release playlists. But it is pretty crazy that this ended up being true. And one of Payola's biggest co-conspirators is none other than Clive Davis. So in 1973, Clive Davis was fired from CBS Records, and CBS Records accused him of around $94,000 in expense account violations, allegedly like involving his personal expenses, like his apartment and hotels. But this 1973 scandal was really fueled by the conspiracy theory that Clive Davis was paying for his artist to play on the radio. And that ended up being at least somewhat true.
Clive Davis. How do you describe Clive Davis? There's an infomercial about him now, which is a document. It's being called a documentary. And it makes him look like this benign octogenarian that's helped all these rock stars with their careers. But people in the music industry really don't like Clive Davis, most of them. And his criminality is kind of amazing. He got busted. He's been for filing false tax returns 3 times and then defrauding the IRS 3 times. He was involved in the biggest payola scandal. That's when record companies give money to radio stations to play their songs. Mm-hmm. He was part of the biggest payola scandal of all time as president of ABC Records. And then there was a Genovese crime guy named Pasquale Falcone, and he got busted smuggling 22 pounds of heroin into the United States. And the Justice Department started digging into him, and they came across all these shell companies that he headed, and Clive Davis was funneling money from ABC Records to these shell companies. So I've just told you about 2 decades worth of criminality by Clive Davis, and that guy has not spent one night in jail. That's what's amazing about him.
I honestly think we are just scratching the surface of conspiracy theories around Clive Davis. Like, I think we're going to find out so much more information that turned out to be true, and all of our suspicions maybe will be confirmed. I don't know. I just think Clive Davis's death has brought forward a lot of witnesses to attest to these crimes that he was maybe allegedly a part of. Speaking of Hollywood crimes, a conspiracy theory that turned out to be true has to do with the way that old Hollywood used to cover up controversy. So I feel like even to this day, they still did a really good job of covering shit up, because on the surface, old Hollywood looks very glamorous and clean and classy. But the whole time, studios were manufacturing fake public images for their stars by burying scandals, controlling relationships, and protecting their most profitable assets. When I say the studios controlled everything, I mean literally everything. Their name, their image, the contacts that they would talk to, their dating lives, their interviews, press coverage, all you can think of, the studios were in charge of all of it. Something that we also learned after the golden age of Hollywood is that studios used to have these morality clauses in contracts, which basically gave them power over a star's private behavior. And these clauses were used to control the actors. And what's interesting here is that there are actual people who were hired just to fix Hollywood scandals, okay? So they are known as studio fixers. One of the most famous ones is a man named Eddie Mannix. His job was literally to protect MGM stars and keep damaging stories away from the public. So this man straight up was like following around all of these glamorous Hollywood celebrities that are supposed to be very clean and proper, and he was just picking up all of the pieces and doing damage control, hiding secrets, and protecting those stars that are worth millions of dollars to the studio.
There was this guy in Hollywood, and he was known as the Fixer. Eddie Mannix worked at MGM Studios. Originally, he was a general manager, and then he moved up to become a VP. Louis B. Mayer may have ran the show, but Eddie Mannix made sure the show ran smoothly. Eddie worked closely with Howard Strickling, who was the head of publicity at MGM. Howard would schmooze the press and manipulate headlines. Eddie was the muscle, and he would make things happen. For example, Clark Gable, MGM star, was a bit of a handful. Let's say, allegedly, Clark Gable had too much to drink and then he got behind the wheel. And then there was an accident. Eddie would swoop in, pay off whoever he needed to pay off, and then the story would go away. Another example, Clark was married. He had an affair with a much younger Loretta Young. Loretta had a bun in the oven, and normally they would persuade young starlets to terminate the situation, but Loretta was Catholic. They devised a plan. Loretta went on vacation and then she got sick. She did press from a bed. Then Loretta announced she was adopting a child named Judy. Later, it was revealed that Judy was Loretta and Clark Gable's biological daughter. Allegedly, he helped cover up the Thelma Todd situation. She was a movie star. She was found unalived in her car in Pacific Palisades. Her ex-husband had ties to the mob. Later, he married Gloria Vanderbilt. Allegedly, Greta Garbo liked women. They covered it up. It's been said that Joan Crawford did a spicy film, which Eddie and MGM paid to have hidden. Then there was Jean Harlow, who married an MGM writer. He unalived himself mysteriously. The biggest scandal that Eddie made go away was probably Patricia Douglas, who was hired by MGM to work at a party for a sales convention. This is when MGM salesman David Ross assaulted her. Patricia filed a criminal complaint, and then MGM began to smear her reputation. The whole thing went away. Not only did Eddie take care of studio situations, he also handled things at home. Eddie was married to a woman named Bernice for over 20 years. He was never faithful. He was abusive. But they were Catholic and they didn't believe in divorce. He had been having affairs the entire time, and he was seeing this woman, Tony Lanier. One day, Eddie's violent with his wife Bernice again, and then he literally breaks her back. So she files for divorce. And then suddenly, Bernice is unalived in a car accident. Instead of mourning, Eddie moves Tony into his house.
I honestly think we could do an entire video on old Hollywood conspiracy theories, either that turned out to be true or that are still unanswered to this day. Whatever you guys think is interesting, let me know. But what's so crazy is the concept of these Hollywood fixers. Like, if a star got arrested, they had people to call. The concept of pregnancy threatening an actress's image, they again made a call and took care of it, which is so crazy because again, we look at this Hollywood golden age, it's literally called the golden age, as this like perfect time. And clearly the stars were all batshit crazy like they are now. They just didn't show it, okay? We don't have fixers these days, except for we do, just not as much. Something else that's really crazy that happened in old Hollywood, this was in the early 1930s, there was this code called the Hays Code, which is also known as the production code, and it's a basically like anti-gay code. Like, there would be gay queer coded characters, but they wouldn't ever be able to explicitly say they were gay. And that was kind of part of the whole like conspiracy of it.
The legend goes that Kenny Ortega wanted Ryan to come out in High School Musical 3, but Disney wasn't ready to go there, so Ortega takes part in a classic Hollywood tradition, queer coding. From roughly 1934 to 1968, Hollywood operated under the Hays Code, which made queer representation effectively impossible. Of course, that didn't stop Hollywood from depicting queer characters, it just meant that audiences had to learn to read the code. So there are absolutely queer characters in classic cinema, just like there's pretty clearly a queer character in the High School Musical universe. Ryan's queer coding is mostly expressed through the way that he dresses, but also like being obsessed with how fabulous his sister is also feels very like Sweet Smell of Success, another very queer-coded film. But nowhere is Ryan's queer coding more explicit, and may I say joyful, than in I Don't Dance from High School Musical 2.
I just think that that's so crazy that that existed. And yeah, she's right, it does still exist to this day, obviously a lot less now that it is more acceptable to have, you know, queer characters. But now that I like look back on TV and cinema, there's so many queer coded characters that I just didn't know that there was a whole fucking rule about that in 1934. That's crazy. One of the craziest conspiracy theories that ended up being true has to do with Harvey Weinstein. So obviously it was a conspiracy theory that Harvey Weinstein was a predator. There were a lot of women that were speaking out about it, but no one was listening to them. And then obviously we now know that that ended up being true. But this is something a little different. This is the conspiracy theory that Harvey Weinstein hired private investigators to collect information on accusers and journalism and use it to blackmail them to stop them from coming out about his abuse, which is so wild, okay? So the first thing we've really heard about this was in 2017 when Ronan Farrow reported in the New Yorker that Harvey Weinstein had hired private investigators, including firms like Black Cube and Kroll, to collect information on accusers and journalists investigating him. And basically the report said these efforts were designed to stop allegations from becoming public. And that is pretty crazy. But also, if we're going into the blue and white conspiracy of it all, Black Cube is actually a private intelligence firm that employs former Israeli intelligence officers, like Mossad agents, and have them work for this company. So yes, Harvey Weinstein used an Israeli private investigative firm to suppress these allegations, and it worked for many years.
Harvey Weinstein hired Israeli spies to gather dirt on his accusers. In 2017, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak revealed that Weinstein had been working with Black Cube, an Israeli private intelligence agency run by former Mossad agents. Weinstein used their services to spy on his accusers, deploying operatives to infiltrate the lives of women like Rose McGowan. They posed as supporters, gaining access to sensitive information to discredit the victims and prevent media exposés. 2017, the Black Cube intelligence firm officially apologized for working with Weinstein. Weinstein's connection to Israel is no surprise. Weinstein has spoken about his father, who was a sergeant stationed in Cairo during World War II. The elder Weinstein aided the Haganah, the precursor to the IOF. In 2017, Weinstein expressed his deep love and appreciation for Israel, saying, quote, "I am an Israeli in my heart and mind." Weinstein, 72, was convicted in 2020 and sentenced to 23 years in prison. But his conviction was overturned on appeal in April and a retrial was ordered. He remains in prison in New York, where he's faced several health crises while in custody.
So that's obviously pretty insane. And the thing is people like Rose McGowan had been speaking about this for a very long time. Like, it was not really a secret that Harvey Weinstein was blackmailing these women, but it wasn't proven until 2017. And I just think that is one of the craziest cover-ups of all time. And the fact that it had to do with the blue and white state is just crazy. Like, is it a coincidence? I guess you can decide that. It's also really fucked up that journalists were also targeted during this. Like, any journalist that wanted to release any information about Harvey Weinstein or any accusations about him basically were also followed and blackmailed. And that's obviously insane. Like, it's insane that that happened. And the thing is so many people were saying that that was happening and no one really believed it. They just thought it was a crazy conspiracy theory. But at the end of the day, here we are. The US government has done a lot of crazy, like, experiments that are very unethical, but they were suspected to be like conspiracy theories. Like, people didn't believe that they were actually happening or did actually happen until later the information was declassified and we learned the truth. So one of those times was Operation Sea Spray. This was where, once again, the US government decided to secretly use American civilians as test subjects in biological warfare experiments. So in 1950, the US military wanted to know basically how vulnerable a major American city would be to a biological attack. So instead of only testing in the lab like normal, they decided to secretly spray bacteria all over the San Francisco Bay. And they just watched how it spread. And this is bonkers that this actually happened. And 1950s, like, not that long ago. I mean, it is, but shit.
In September of 1950, the U.S. Navy secretly sprayed the San Francisco Bay with bacteria just to see what would happen. Operation Sea Spray. The Navy released these two types of bacteria from a ship sprayed into the San Francisco Bay, believing them to be harmless to humans. They wanted to determine how vulnerable the city was to a biological attack. I'm not going to attempt to say these two types of bacteria, but the second one is in the lineage of a type of bacteria that was created at Camp Diedrich, also in the 50s. And based on the results from 43 testing locations, nearly all of San Francisco's 800,000 residents at the time would have been dosed with this bacteria. Directly following this operation, there was a rise in very serious urinary tract infections and a rise in pneumonia cases, although they could not directly correlate the illnesses with the operation. There's also no evidence that the Navy alerted health officials before blanketing the area with bacteria. But wait, there's more! Also in the 50s, the Army dispersed zinc cadmium sulfide. They released it from airplanes into the atmosphere over Minnesota and other Midwestern states. We now know that zinc cadmium sulfide is cancer-causing, and particles of this were detected 1,000 miles away. In 1966, in New York City, the military dropped light bulbs full of this bacteria into the subways. You know, just to see how bacteria would spread, because the only way to combat bio attacks is to do it on your own people first. And there are many, many more cases like this that are super interesting.
So that's just obviously bonkers, okay? It is so crazy that the US government got away with all of this for such a long time, and it makes you wonder, what are they getting away with right now that we're gonna find out in 10, 20 years? I'm scared. I'm actually really not a conspiracy theorist that believes that COVID was fake or anything, or not fake, but you released onto us. But now with this kind of information, I'm like, maybe. I mean, I still don't really think that, because it will just wither my faith in humanity way too much for me to believe in that. But clearly, they've been doing shit like this for a long time, and they got away with it. Also, after this bacteria was sprayed, 11 people in the San Francisco Bay Area were hospitalized with Serratia infections, and one of them actually died. And the US Army this whole time just kept saying, oh, it was just, the outbreak is just a coincidence. Coincidence. The man who passed away, named Edward Nevin, his family actually filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the government, arguing that the bacteria released in the test caused his death. And he did not win this lawsuit because, again, the severity of this was being suppressed and covered up. So crazy. And I think Operation Sea Spray is a really good but terrifying example to show how easily national security can become an excuse to treat civilians like lab rats. Not liking that. I'm not liking it. The next theory I want to talk about that ended up being true, that the government did once again, has to do with the Holmesburg prison experiments. Now, I thought the Tuskegee experiments that we've talked about in past videos like this were the craziest things I've heard of, where, the US government purposely withheld Black men specifically from getting treatment for syphilis. I literally was like, okay, yeah, that's crazy that happened. It's happened more than that. A lot more. So this one is actually bananas, and it has to do with prisoners. They would take incarcerated people and expose them to really painful skin tests, mind-altering drugs, harmful radiation, and experiments involving products from hair dye to detergents to chemical warfare agents. What do you mean? What do you mean? And it's really fucked up and dark, because a lot of these men agreed to do this because they were poor, incarcerated, and they needed money for commissary or bail. So they kind of had no other choice. These people technically volunteered, but really they were coerced into volunteering themselves.
You know what breaks my heart? That we talk about Tuskegee like it was some sort of isolated betrayal, like it was the medical horror story that Black people endured. But what if I told you, while our uncles were being lied to in Alabama, our brothers in Philly were being burned alive from the inside out by dermatologists? Holmesburg Prison, Northeast Philly. From the 1950s through the 1970s, Black men, most of them poor, most of them awaiting trial, not even sentenced, were used as human test subjects. Not for science fiction, but for real-life corporate contracts. Companies like Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemicals, and even the U.S. Army. They partnered with a dermatologist named Dr. Albert Kingman. He walked into that prison and said verbatim, it was like a farmer seeing a field ripe for harvest. He said that about Black men in cages. They tested lotions and shampoos, but they also tested Agent Orange and radioactive isotopes, and chemicals that literally ate through skin. They'd apply the product, cover it with a bandage, and leave it for days. Men were left with burns, keloids, lifelong pain, and no real explanation for what was done to them. Were they told? Kinda. They signed forms, but what does consent really mean when you're desperate? When you're broke, dehumanized, and just trying to survive prison? And while Tuskegee was happening in Alabama, where Black men were denied treatment, Holmesburg was its northern twin. Same disregard, same racism, same silence. But here's the difference. Tuskegee became a national scandal. Holmesburg swept under the rug. No apologies, no restitution, no national conversation. So when people ask why we don't trust the medical system, it's not just because of Tuskegee. It's because of places like Holmesburg, places they still won't talk about. Because if the nation admitted that it happened there, they'd have to admit that it could happen anywhere. And if you don't have justice, you don't have closure. Just wounds they keep trying to gaslight us into forgetting.
So this is obviously incredibly fucked up. I cannot believe that things like this are really not taught in school. Maybe that is the American education system, but damn, they really do like to cover things up, and it's fucked up. I feel like acknowledging parts of our history that were so wrong is important, and I do think that that is why our country is the way that it is, and thinks that they're the greatest country in the world. You know, they're a little delusional. And I just think that Dr. Kligman saying when he first saw Holmesburg that he reported it as feeling like he saw acres of skin that he could test on is so ass backwards that, like, I don't even have words for it. Like, he didn't see those people as humans, he saw them as test subjects, and that's really what they were. And this wasn't just one doctor here doing research. This has ties to the University of Pennsylvania, pharmaceutical companies, cosmetic companies like we saw Johnson & Johnson, the US Army, and there's possibly some intelligence/military linked research as well, but that's part is kind of still conspiratorial technically. It's just crazy because this isn't just like, oh, you know, old-timey unethical practices of, you know, testing beauty products or whatever. These are products that we use today. So there are products, ingredients, and medical knowledge that came from these systems that treated vulnerable people like disposable research material. And I just feel like we have to sit with that for a second next time you use Johnson & Johnson or something, allegedly. I just cannot, like, fathom that this was really a thing, but it absolutely was. And it makes you wonder how many of these experiments happened that we still don't know about. Because to assume that we have confirmed all of the conspiracy theories from, you know, the 50s and 60s is stupid. Like, there's probably a lot of shit that we haven't even tapped into that was going on, and it freaks me the fuck out. It really does. Which leads us to our next conspiracy theory that turned out to be true, which is the Willowbrook hepatitis experiments. This is literally so fucked up. Like, so fucked up. Basically, there were doctors and researchers who were deliberately infecting disabled children with hepatitis in the name of medical research, and then also keeping these children in horrific conditions. Horrific. So Willowbrook State School was a state-run institution on Staten Island, New York. It was for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The conditions in general were horrific, okay? It was overcrowded, it was unsanitary, and hepatitis was spreading through the institution, likely, very likely due to the unsanitary nature of the building and the way that they kept these kids covered in their own feces and all this terrible things. But instead of focusing on fixing the conditions, the researchers used the outbreak as an opportunity to study hepatitis. What the fuck do you mean? Children? I can't. So this was beginning in the 1950s, and the studies were led by Dr. Sal Krugman of New York University. So these children were deliberately exposed to hepatitis so that these researchers could study how the disease spread and whether certain treatments or preventatives worked. So this is crazy. Okay, some children were fed materials containing hepatitis. Some were given injections. Researchers studied the infection, immunity, and possible prevention. So they wanted to study that on actual human children that were disabled. I can't believe that this was a thing. The parents were asked for consent for this, but the ethics behind the consent were very controversial. Like, they weren't fully aware of what their children were going through, because the researchers' defense was essentially that hepatitis was already so common at this Willowbrook institution that most of the kids were gonna get it anyway. So why do you care if we just, like, inject them with it? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? So researchers argued, you know, their case that they were making for the parent consent forms was essentially the idea that they're exposing these children under controlled conditions, potentially helping to develop prevention methods. But they were probably gonna get sick anyway, should never be a reason to purposely inject disabled children with hepatitis. I feel like that's shouldn't be like a difficult concept to grasp, but clearly in the 1950s it was. So again, parents technically did sign consent forms, but this is where it's really disturbing, is that some accounts and ethics discussions argue that these families may have felt pressured because Willowbrook had limited availability to begin with, so participation in the hepatitis unit could be connected to admission or better conditions while their kids were there. So they were kind of coerced into signing this. So what's crazy is it started happening in the 1950s, as we said, and it really wasn't whistleblowed until 1972 when Geraldo Rivera made a expose on the horrifying conditions within the institution. And it was not just like, again, the medical ethics scandal of it. It was also a disability rights scandal because the way that they were being treated was horrific.
And I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth. I think all of us are at fault, and I think it's just it's long overdue that something be done about it.
How long have you been at Willowbrook?
18 years.
How is it living on the ward that you live?
Disgrace.
The attendants are trying their best, but the staff is just too small to do anything more than just try and keep the place clean. When there's only one person to take care of 30 or 40, nothing good can possibly happen. No rehabilitation, no training, nothing. The attendants are as much the victim of the conditions here as the patients are.
Walked a couple of steps and I had to open a second door. I was directed down to the end of the hall. There was another steel door. At 19 years of age, I basically said to myself, what have I gotten myself into? Who is locked behind 3 steel doors? Pushed the door open, and when I walked in, on the other side of the door were 40 toddlers. And why in God's name were they locked behind 3 steel doors?
When I applied for my job, I was really never taken to any of the wards. They just accepted my application and they told me when I would start. And then I went to Building 6, which was my building. And the building supervisor opened the door to the day room, and there was the chaos.
You have no idea what was inside. No idea.
I just think the worst part about this is obviously these researchers looked at children who were already neglected by society and decided that their suffering made them convenient for research. And I just, like, my brain cannot compute how incredibly fucked up that is. And the fact that it went hidden for so long is sick and twisted. And I think Willowbrook is a really good, but horrifying, again, example of showing what can happen when vulnerable people are treated as research opportunities instead of actual human beings. It's disgusting, to say the least. All right, I guess on a bit of a lighter note, I want to talk about the conspiracy theory about makeup and skincare. It is the problem solution theory that I believe goes without saying in a lot of aspects of life, especially around specifically women's products, like things that they want us to buy. For one, I've always had the conspiracy theory in my heart, like I always believed this. That makeup makes your skin worse, so then you need skincare, and then you need more makeup to cover up the fact that you have like acne or something, whatever. I've always believed in that kind of cycle, but the thing is that has actually been proven to be true, which is very concerning. So you buy makeup to cover, you know, redness, acne, whatever, and that makeup basically clogs your pores, irritates your skin gets worse, so you buy the cleansers, the serums, all of that stuff, but sometimes that stuff even irritates your skin even more, which I do believe may be part of a bigger conspiracy theory overall. But it seems like this has been basically admitted that jean companies work together with pocketbook. I don't know why I said pocketbook. What am I, a fucking Italian grandma from New York? My Nona? Pocketbook? I haven't heard anyone say that in so long. Purse companies work together with clothing companies, because if you've literally lived your life ever as a woman, or even honestly in general, you probably know this, that women's jeans and pants notoriously do not have pockets either at all, or they have really tiny pockets. And It's true that the reason that they do that is so that we will have to buy bags and purses to compensate for our lack of fucking pockets. Is that not insane that that actually happens? I always believed this conspiracy theory, but I never knew that that was actually genuinely true. And I feel like it overall opens the doors to bigger conspiracy theories when it comes to marketing, because I truly think because there are just so many products that cause the problem that forces you to buy another product that is the solution, but it's really just a cycle. It's just a cycle and we're all getting fucking scammed. So cool. Cool. The last theory I want to talk about has to do with food. We've talked about before how the sugar industry hired, which is so crazy, hired these Harvard scientists to basically confirm that fat is worse for you than sugar, and fat is what leads to heart disease. That's why the early 2000s was an entire like anti-trans fat kind of, snack marketing. And again, I do think that that's happening with protein now, but that's for another day. But there is an overall conspiracy theory that is definitely true, which is that food companies do not just make snacks taste good, it's that they actually engineer ultra processed foods to be craveable and addictive so that you keep buying and can't stop. And I do feel like, as a fat girl, I can weigh in on this. I do think this is true. So Sanford Medicine actually described something called the bliss point, which is basically the ideal level of sugar, salt, or fat in a food product that maximally makes the food pleasurable and addictive and encourages overconsumption. And our American food companies are using that as a way to make our food actually more addictive. And you know what? I don't know what they put it in now, but it has to be the bliss point, okay? I just think it's so dark that there are so many different things that our government has lied about, our, products that we buy every day, food. All of it is just a money-making process, which I know, but in my heart, I like to pretend that people are better than they seem, and honestly, they're not. This is scary shit, okay? I cannot believe these conspiracy theories end up being true. But anyway, that is it for today's video. If you guys liked it, please give it a big thumbs up. Let me know which conspiracy theory that turned out to be true shocked you the most. I would love to hear your thoughts, but that is it. Make sure you follow me on TikTok and Instagram and subscribe for new videos every week, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.